Hi, welcome to an introduction to philosophy. My name is Mark Thorsby, and in this video we overview some of the ultimate questions the philosophers address and ask. Today our topic is actually going to be, does God exist? What we're going to be taking a look at is really two famous well-known arguments for God's existence. The first is St. Anselm's ontological argument, and the second argument here is St. Thomas Aquinas's five classic arguments for God's existence. There are actually many other arguments, and we'll be talking a little bit about some of those arguments today. But principally, this video is mainly just going to present to you the arguments for God's existence, and I'll comment on some of the problems with some of these arguments. So welcome back. Now, it's interesting because this question, whether or not God exists, this is one of these questions that everyone seems to have an answer for, or at least everyone thinks the philosophy should and is meant to in some way address this question, whether or not God exists. I'm just going to sort of go through this. But before we get going and before we talk about what these arguments are, I think it's important for us to pause and take a moment and ask this question. What exactly is a proof? Can we prove that God exists? And what does it mean to give an argument for God's existence? And so sometimes there's the discussion about whether or not proofs for God's existence could be given. And I want to begin by just pausing and reflecting what exactly counts as a proof. So what I want to do now is I really want to give an example of a proof and see if we can glean some of the characteristics of what counts as a proof and what it means to prove something in general, right? So let's just begin with this question. What is a proof? And I think that I want to sort of approach this question phenomenologically. And that means I want you to think about the experience of what happens when you actually see a proof, okay? So what I want to start off with is something that's totally unrelated to God's existence and see if I can prove something for you. And what I want to prove for you is what's known as the Pythagorean theorem. Pythagorean theorem. Most of you know this theorem, hopefully all of you, and that's a squared plus b squared equals c squared. It's a very famous theorem in geometry, and of course it applies only to right angle triangles. So, and the idea is the hypotenuse, the length of the hypotenuse, will be equal to the combination of the other two sides of the triangle squared, right? A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Now the question is, how many of you have actually seen the proof, right? That is, we have to make a distinction here. Most of us know the theorem, but most of us do not know the proof. That is, we can't explain why it is that the Pythagorean theorem is true. Now, there are different types of proofs. In fact, the Pythagorean theorem has many, many proofs. It's something of a pastime for mathematicians to think of new ways to prove the Pythagorean theorem. In fact, there's a very famous United States president who actually presented a unique proof for the Pythagorean theorem in a session of Congress. So I'll let you, it's sort of interesting sort of to think about on how Congress was utterly different in the past, where they actually were proving mathematical truths in Congress. That doesn't happen anymore, right? Unfortunately. So, I'll tell you who that is. It's President Garfield was the one who came up with his own proof for the Pythagorean theorem. But what I wanted to do today is give you the Pythagorean theorem that most scholars probably think that it's the type of proof that Pythagoras himself probably actually gave. And it's known as a geometric proof. And what you're going to have to do is I want to give you the proof here. But as I give you the proof, I want you to consider what I'm doing, right? And so I want you to assume I have four right triangles, okay? And I want you to imagine that I have these triangles, and that if you were, I have blocks of these triangles. I have four right triangles, and they're all like the same size. And let's imagine I configure them in such a way, right? Actually, here, let's make this a little bit better. Let me erase that. Okay. So imagine I have four triangles and I lay them out together in this fashion. So they're right triangles, right? They're all the same size, right? Even though my picture of it is poor. That looks so bad. Hold on, I have to redo it. I can't just take it. So let's see here. Here we go. Okay. So let's imagine we have these four triangles here. Okay. Now, what we're going to say is we're going to label the sides. We're going to say that this is the C side, right? This is the A side, and this is the B side. Okay. So that means that in the way we've laid out our four triangles, we have the C side on each of the internal edges here, right, of perimeter. Now remember, we're just laying these out. And so that means that the short side is always B. So this is a B, this is a B, and this is a B. And the long side here is always A, right? So here you go. So we just lay these four triangles out. So just take a look at this. So you can see that what we've created here in the middle, right, is a big empty space. But what's the area of the empty space? Well, it's clear that we have a C square, right? The area here is equal to C times C, right? Which is C squared. Okay, now let's imagine though that I want to rearrange these very same blocks, and instead I decide to arrange them like such. Okay, so now I've arranged them as such. Now that means that right here these are empty space. I've basically turned the triangles and made them face. So then now the C side is this internal line, right? And then here this is the long side A, and this is the short side B, right? This is B and this is A, right? And then this would be A, this length here, I guess. And then over here is B, right? So now take a look here. We've laid the triangles out, and now what we've done is we've essentially moved the empty space that was originally here, right? But now take a look at it, right? The length of the perimeter of this larger square we created was A plus B. And we've maintained that, where here we have A, but we also have B in terms of the final length for these two, right? And the same thing goes here. We have B and A, and over here we have A and B, B and A. We have the same format. So that means that the outer perimeter of figure 1 must be equal to the outer perimeter of figure 2, and here we're including these empty spaces. Now take a look, what size are these empty spaces? Well, here we have an A side, and here we have an A side, right? A times A is A squared, and over here we have a B side and a B side, so this is B squared. So you can see that if we subtract the empty spaces, if we combine the empty spaces of these two, it must be equal to the empty space of C squared. Why? Because the perimeter is the same size and we're using the exact same four blocks. So you can see here, C squared must be equal to A squared plus B squared. Right? I hope you can see that. So we've done a geometric proof, and if I had four blocks, I could just prove it to you. But what's interesting is notice that to understand the proof of the argument, you don't actually need the blocks, right? So now let's think about it. Now, first off, I'm going to assume that all of you agree that this is a proof, right? That there's no other way for anyone to recognize. So the idea here is that I don't think any of you are going to disagree on how we've proven the Pythagorean theorem, or that we have proven the Pythagorean theorem. At this point, there should be no question for you going forward about whether or not the theorem here is actually true, right? We've proven it. So what are the characteristics of proof? Well, some of the characteristics of proof seems to be one, the proof has to be objective. And when I say objective, what I mean is it's the same for all. It's the same result for all people. That is, no matter who you are, right? Whether you are an American watching this video now, or you are in a different country, you speak a different language, or you live in the past, you live in ancient Greece, 2,500 years ago, this proof will work for you no matter what. It's the same result for every person who sees the proof. So that's the first thing. Now, why is it objective? It's because it seems like the concepts, right, are fixed, right? And it looks like because the concepts don't change, that is, the ideas of length don't change, and it also doesn't matter what size triangle we're talking about. It's sufficiently formalistic and abstract such that we can say that the content of the idea is the very idea of the triangle, right? Or I should say the right triangle, right? Is sufficient to get us to a conclusion that's going to be the same for all right triangles. So the concepts are in some sense fixed, right? Now, the other thing is it's intuitively clear, right? I think there's a sort of element of intuition here, and some people may disagree, in which you can somehow see the proof, and you can see that there's no other possibilities for the concept. So the other things we might say is that the proof, in terms of it being intuitively clear as a proof, it's valid. And when I say valid, that means that the reasoning from the premises to the conclusion is necessary. That is, the reasoning provided here in this case, geometrically demonstrated, right, is such that there's no other relationship. It's a necessary connection. That is, a squared plus b squared is necessarily connected here in a fixed manner to this conclusion of c squared, right? Or a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So it's intuitively clear and it's valid. So what I want you to do as we go through the proofs for God's existence is, if you will, to create a checkbox and ask these questions as we go. Is the proof for God's existence that we're covering, are they objective? Are the concepts fixed? Is there this notion of intuitive clarity? Or is the argument valid? That is it necessarily derived? Is it an argument of necessity? Now, I'm not saying that these characteristics of proof are the only or even the best ways for us to characterize what a proof is, but it seems to be, when we look at a proof like this, one in which we all do seem to agree that it counts as a proof, these sorts of elements seem to arise, right? So what I want us to do now as we go to the question of God's existence, we ask this question, what is a proof? Let's think about this, because at the end of today's lecture, I want us to go back and to ask whether or not these proofs really counted, or whether or not these arguments for God's existence should be counted as a proof, I guess is the question. So what the next thing I want to mention here is I want to make a couple distinctions about arguments. Now, it's true that there's a difference between arguments and proofs. We may have arguments for God's existence, but maybe they're not proofs. But really, I guess what we're interested in when we ask, does God exist? We want to know, is there proof of God's existence? Now, when we think about just arguments, we covered this in our last video here when we talked about reasoning. When we talk about arguments, there's two types of arguments, right? There's deductive arguments and there's inductive arguments. Deductive arguments, again, are arguments by necessity, meaning that they're arguments in which the conclusions are necessarily related to the premises and vice versa. And inductive arguments are arguments by probability. So you can see here, proofs have to be deductive, not inductive, because probability can't prove. We want proof that's beyond certain. We want proof that's 100% certain. And inductive arguments by probability can never do that. There are inductive arguments for God's existence. For instance, we'll talk about a little bit here if I have time. I'll mention William Paley's Watchmaker argument for God's existence. This is a classic argument for God's existence, which basically goes like this. Imagine you're walking on a beach, right? And you're walking on a beach and suddenly you kick a pocket watch. Now, the pocket watch are you going to think that the pocket watch is got there by chance? That is, it is just the result of a piece of shell. It's the result of some sort of natural, chaotic, unintelligent process. No, you're going to think the pocket watch got on the beach because someone dropped it there. Why? Because someone had to create the pocket watch, right? And so what William Paley argues here in this famous Watchmaker argument is that, here, I'll put it right here so you can see. What he argues in this famous Watchmaker argument is that from the watch, because the watch has a certain degree of contrivance, that is, we notice that it can only work in such and such a way, right? It's contrived, and that reveals that there must be a designer or a watchmaker. And his argument is that when we look at the world, especially after the scientific revolution, we discover that the world is extremely complex, actually, in terms of its natural laws, in terms of the mechanics of motion and so forth. is that there's actually looks to be a high degree of contrivance in the world. If the world appears to be contrived in the same way that we admitted that there must be a watchmaker, so too we should admit that there is a world maker, right? And maybe let me here just give you a quick sort of rundown on this argument. This watchmaker argument here is known as an argument by analogy. So and I'm not going to spend too much time on it here because I didn't have you read it. Paley's watchmaker argument. But I do think it's important to go over this argument because I find that this is one of these arguments that most people actually think about when they actually, for themselves, ask the question of God's existence. Now, the first thing is, remember, this is an inductive argument, meaning it's an argument by probability. Why? Because it's an argument by analogy. Remember, analogy is when you say something is to something else. An analogy is when you try to transfer the properties of one relation into the properties of another, right? So the way this argument works is we have a watch, and because of contrivance, right? This is the term that Paley uses, the idea that it's contrived in some sense. We must deduce that there's a watchmaker. So you can see here that a relation is set up between the watch and the watchmaker. And what Paley wants to say is we have a world, and that the world also appears to be contrived. And so doesn't that mean we have to conclude that there is a world maker, right? A world maker. If there's a world and the world is somehow contrived, then there must be a world maker. Right? So this argument works by analogy. It's saying that the watch is to the watchmaker as the world is to the world maker. Of course, the world maker is God, right? So this is the argument by analogy, saying that this relationship here, right, is essentially analogous to this relationship over here. Now, whether or not that's the case is ultimately the question. That is, does the analogy hold up? And I think there are a lot of problems with it. It could. Now, it's an argument about probability, so it could be the case, but there's a lot of problems with it. There's a famous philosopher by the name of David Hume who actually spent a lot of time attacking this argument. And I'm not going to go through those attacks right now. Maybe at the end of our video we'll come to it. But this is, again, an argument that we would say is an argument by analogy, or this is the watchmaker argument. Okay? That's an inductive argument. What we're interested in today, really, is the deductive arguments for God's existence. Now, I want to make a distinction. I have to be a little bit careful about the distinction I'm making here, because this is principally an epistemological distinction, but it's a helpful distinction for us. And the difference here is the distinction between a priori versus a posteriori. Now, we did talk about this difference when we talked a little bit about logic a couple videos ago. We said that a priori refers to before experience. That's fundamentally what it means, right? And so what we're going to say is that you could have deductive arguments that are a priori, meaning you could have arguments by necessity that do not depend upon your experience of a world in order for that argument to succeed. By contrast, an a posteriori argument is an argument that depends upon experience, right? Because posteriori means after experience for us, right? And what we're going to see today is that essentially Anselm provides us with what looks like an a priori argument for God's existence, whereas St. Thomas Aquinas provides us with an argument that's an a posteriori argument. That is, an argument that depends upon our experience of the world, right? And I think this will make sense. Now, why is this an important distinction? Because ultimately, since Aquinas gives a posteriori arguments, his arguments say that given our experience, right, if we take our experience, there must necessarily be the case such that there's a God for this, that, and the other reason, right? But the thing is in these a posteriori arguments, if our experience is wrong, the arguments fail. Whereas the a priori argument here that Anselm gives us, what's known as the ontological argument, this argument says it doesn't matter what your experience of the world is, right? The very concept of God itself requires that we admit that God exists, right? That is, the argument is pre-experiential, if you will, or a priori. Okay, so that's all I mean by this distinction between a priori and a posteriori. Now, why is it important? Because these arguments, if we can overturn our experience, will fail, and this argument depends upon the conceptual nature of the ideas we're actually talking about. So these are the types of general arguments. Now, there are other arguments out there. The arguments we're going to cover essentially are the really big ones. But of course, there's many other arguments, especially inductive arguments. Okay. Now, there's a question here: is when I say deductive, and I'm talking about experience, does that mean that a question you could ask rather is, are all posteriori arguments actually inductive in nature because they depend upon your experience of the world in such a way? And it depends on how people are going to argue. If you're someone like David Hume and you take this problem of induction, yeah, you are going to say that. But someone like St. Thomas Aquinas is admittedly not going to say that. He sees these arguments as deductive, meaning they're arguments that take our experience and derive what necessarily follows from our experience. Okay, let's move here to Anselm. Okay, so here's a picture of Anselm. I'm not going to talk too much about who Anselm was. I will say that he was the Archbishop of Canterbury. You may have heard of because of the Canterbury Tales, but long before the Canterbury Tales ever occurred. But he was originally from Italy. He was a monk and a priest, obviously. And the argument that we get from Anselm here is known today as the ontological argument. And maybe I should say a little bit about what we mean by ontological. The word ontological, let's go. Anselm's ontological argument. Now, ontology. What does ontological mean? Well, it comes from the term ontology, essentially. And ontology comes from the term ontic. And what ontic refers to here is being. And what we're going to see is that this argument is going to argue that the very idea of God requires the existence of God. As the idea of God is going to require the being of God. And so it's called the ontological argument because it's fundamentally related to the question of the nature of God as such, right? The idea here is that God's being necessarily includes God's existence. And so we'll sort of see how that works here in just a moment. The other thing to say is that this argument is also known as a reductio ad absurdum argument. Now, a reductio ad absurdum argument is when you take the premises of an argument and then you derive that those premises necessarily result in something that's absurd or contradictory. That is, you reduce it to an absurdity. And that because those premises are reduced to a certain absurdity, you can conclude the opposite of the absurdity, right? You're basically saying that if you believe such and such, then you have to also believe this. This is totally contradictory, doesn't make sense. Therefore, you should believe the opposite of your premises, right? That's fundamentally how a reductio ad absurdum argument works, and you'll see that here in just a minute. And again, it's something of an a priori argument, meaning that this argument is independent of our experience, right? It doesn't matter what our experience looks like. Now, what I want to do here is actually take a look at Anselm's argument, actually take a look at the actual text, because again, one of the things about this argument is actually given to us in the form of a prayer in Anselm's principal work, which is something of a prayer book, and it's a meditation, right? And it comes from Proselygon, in which he attempts to give this a priori proof. Now, what I want to do is sort of run through, just read it out with you slowly here, and then try to break it down. By the way, this is one of the more difficult arguments, and I won't be surprised if you have trouble understanding it. Right. So again, this is Anselm sort of meditating and praying to God. He writes, "O Lord, you who give understanding to faith as far as you know it to be beneficial, give me to understand that you are just as we believe, and that you are what we believe. We certainly believe that you are something than which nothing greater can be conceived." Now, first off, this is going to become actually quite important. Notice right here, he's defining God's existence. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Then he goes on, but is there any such nature, since the fool has set his heart there in his heart, God is not, or there is no God. I think that comes from Proverbs somewhere in the Bible. However, when this very same fool hears what I say, when he hears of something than which nothing greater can be conceived, he certainly understands what he hears. What he understands in relation to his understanding, right? Esse intellectu, right? In his intellect, existing in his intellect. What he understands stands in relation to his understanding, even if he does not understand that it exists. For it is one thing for a thing to stand in relation to our understanding. It is another thing for us to understand that it really exists, right? So here he's making an important distinction, that we can have the notion of God in our understanding, and that's different than saying that God really exists, right? So he's making that distinction. So for instance, when a painter imagines that he's about to paint, he has it in his relation of understanding. However, he does not yet understand that it exists because he has not yet made it, right? So the idea here is when a painter goes to paint, they have an idea of the painting in their head, but it doesn't exist in reality, right? So so the painting's in his understanding, but doesn't really exist. But after he paints it, then he both has it in relation to his understanding and understands that it exists. Therefore, even the fool is convinced that something than which nothing greater can be conceived at least stands in relation to his understanding, because when he hears it, he understands it. And whatever he understands stands in relation to his understanding. And Jory, I'll break that down here just in a moment. I know that sounds confusing, but let's keep going here. And certainly, that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot stand only in relation to understanding. For if it stands at least in relationship to the understanding, it can be conceived to be also in reality, for this is something greater. Therefore, if that than which nothing greater cannot be conceived only stood in relation to the understanding, then that than which nothing greater can be conceived would be something than which a greater can be conceived, but this is clearly impossible. Therefore, something than which a greater cannot be conceived undoubtedly both stands in relation to understanding and exists in reality. Now, somewhere along the way, from here to here, he gives the argument, and I have a feeling many of you are sort of maybe lost when you read that. What exactly is Anselm arguing? Well, let's go back and let's take a look at it. Let's see if we can break it down. And so what I've done here is I have the argument simplified for you. And basically the argument says this. First, we begin by defining God. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, okay? That's the first moment. We define God in such a way. Now notice, this is not the typical way in which we normally define God. Now, it depends on who you are and what you think God means, but most people today, especially this argument, is emphasizing the assumption that God is monotheistic. There's a monotheistic God. God is all-powerful. God is all-knowing. God is all-good, and so forth, right? The classic monotheistic conception of God that at least Christians, Muslims, and Jews all share, right? So this is the classic notion of God we're talking about. But notice he doesn't define God in a positive sense. God is defined negatively. And this has become very important, actually. That this is, we might say, a negative argument for God's existence, not a positive argument. Okay, so first off, we begin by defining God in this way, right? The second part of the argument is we have to admit that existence is greater than non-existence, right? Sometimes I'll tell my class, what would you rather have? A suitcase full of money, a real suitcase full of money, or, I'm sorry, would you rather have an existing suitcase full of money or a non-existing suitcase full of money? Which one's greater? Well, obviously existence is greater, right? Or at least so it would seem. So that's the second major point here, is we have to admit that when something exists, that's greater than non-existence. And when we mean greater, we mean it in the same way that we mean greater up here, right? These two terms mean the same thing. So here's the third part. The third part that says, those who hold that God does not exist have an idea of God in their head, right? The idea is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? And that's what he's saying. He's when they have this notion in their intellect, right? But here's point number 4. But those who hold that God does not exist, that is the atheist, therefore hold that than which nothing greater can be conceived does not exist, and it is therefore not the greatest thing that could be conceived. Which means that the denial of God's existence is contradictory. It's absurd. Therefore, God exists. Let me see if I can sort of draw you an explanation, maybe that'll help you see the problem, right? The idea here is, imagine we have two different people, right? And here, forgive my picture, but let's imagine we have two people. This person's not too pretty. And then here's our other person. Okay, really quite ugly, so my apologies. So imagine we have two different people. Over here we have the believer, right? This is the person who believes that God exists. And here we have the denier, the person who says that God does not exist, or the atheist, right? So the thing about the believer is what? Remember, Anselm made this distinction between the understanding, between having an idea in the understanding, right? Having an idea in your understanding versus that idea having reality in the world, right? So the person who believes God exists, they have a notion of God in their head, right? This notion of God is, well, it's that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And the believer thinks that this thing actually exists in the world, right? God is actually here. It's both in the mind as well as in the world, right? Now, by contrast, let's take the person who denies that God exists, the atheist. This person also has a notion of God in their head, but they don't think that it exists in the world, right? They think that there's a concept, but the concept is nothing more than a concept, right? So this is fundamentally, right? So this person says it's in the understanding and it's in the world. This person has it in the understanding, but it's not in the world. But think about it. If God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? If you can conceive of nothing greater than God, and you simultaneously say that existence is greater than non-existence, it can only follow that the person who's an atheist here, the denier, what they're actually saying is that than which nothing greater can be conceived does not exist, which means that than which nothing greater can be conceived is precisely that than is not that which can be greater that can be that than which nothing greater can be conceived is precisely that not the greatest thing that could be conceived. This is a contradiction, right? Because essentially they're saying that that this is the greatest thing you can imagine, but it can't be the greatest thing. But that doesn't make any sense, right? The idea here is that they ultimately hold something of an absurdity, right? That it's contradictory, so therefore God has to exist. Another way of saying it is seeing the problem like this. Imagine whenever we talk about something, we can always talk about the essence of something. That is, the essential properties for that thing, right? And we can also typically make a distinction between the essence of something and its existence. So take, for instance, my coffee cup. My coffee cup has certain essential features, and I could list them off here, right? The coffee cup is solid. It's able to hold liquid, and so on and so forth, right? Those are essential. But is the existence of the coffee cup, is that an essential characteristic? The answer is no, because I can destroy the existence, right? I could smash the coffee cup, but I'll still know what a coffee cup is. So existence is not essential for all things, or most things. But when we talk about the question of God, and we define God as the greatest thing, right? Or that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And if existence is greater than non-existence, then that means existence must actually be a category of one of God's essential features. And of course, existence is another term for being. And so what we're saying is that the very idea of God has within it the essential element of God's being, right? That is, the very idea of God infers the being of God. Now, this is the fundamental idea of the argument, and this is why it's called the ontological argument, right? But it's a reduction ad absurdum argument. Now, the question, though, is, does this argument actually make a lot of sense? Should we really believe that this argument works? Well, what are some of the critiques of Anselm? The first principal critique in his own life was by another priest by the name of Ganilo, right? And he sort of has two questions here. The first is, he gives what's known as the Lost Island example. Does the Lost Island exist? And he says, well, let's actually take a look at what Ganilo actually says, right? Here, one sec. My apologies. Here we go. And by the way, he gives the same argument here again. Right. And you can read this later, right? So here's what Ganilo said. He says, consider this example. Certain people say that somewhere in the ocean there's an island, which they call the lost island because of the difficult, or rather the impossibility of finding what does not exist. They say that it is more abundantly filled with inestimable riches and delights than the island of the blessed, and that although it has no owner or inhabitant, it excels all the lands that men inhabit taken together in the unceasing abundance of its fertility. Now, when someone tells me that there is such an island, I easily understand what's being said, for there's nothing difficult in that. Suppose, however, as a consequence of this, he goes on to say, you cannot doubt that this island, more excellent than all the islands, actually exists somewhere in reality, because it undoubtedly stands in relation to understanding. Since it's more excellent not simply to stand in relation to the understanding, but to be in reality as well. Therefore, this island must necessarily be in reality. Otherwise, any other land that exists in reality would be more excellent than this. And so, what is he saying here? He's basically saying, okay, well, let's imagine we have the greatest island that we could conceive of. Obviously, existence is greater than non-existence, so if it's the greatest island we can conceive of, don't we have to admit that that island exists, right? And so what is Anselm's response? It's actually very curt, right? He says, my reasoning, you claim, is as if something should say that there is an island in the ocean which surpasses the whole earth in its fertility, but which is called a lost island because of the difficulty or even the impossibility of finding something that does not exist. And as if he should not argue that no one can doubt that it actually does exist, because the words describing it are easily understood. I can confidently say that if anyone discovers for me something existing either in fact or at least in thought, other than that than which nothing greater can be conceived, and is able to apply the logic of my argument to it, I shall find that the lost island for him, and shall give it to him as something which he will never lose again. What is he saying here? He's saying this is not a sufficient argument against the ontological argument. Why? Because when we define God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, that's not the same thing as saying that we imagine an island that's really wonderful and beautiful, right? Because notice, what are we talking about? In the case of the island, right, we're just saying that, notice that his description of the island is a positive description, right? When we talked about God, God was defined in negative terms, right? We said that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? Which means that we're saying what we can't do. We're defining God in terms of what we can't do. We can't conceive of anything greater. Now, the island is a positive. We're saying it's a fertile island and all this sort of thing. Now, that's the first thing, and this is important, because what it ultimately means is that he's not saying that God is omnipotent and all-knowing, and he's trying to prove that. He's not proving that at all. So there's a different order of explanation that's required for the island. The second thing is the island is not, right, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. It's not that than which right? So the island is not that than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? Um, only God. Oops, where is it? Only God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So Anselm's argument is that, listen, my argument works for God, right? It doesn't work for islands, right? Because what's better than an island? Even the best island of all. Well, God would be better, right? That than which nothing greater can be conceived. And what Ganilo is doing is he's giving us an example of something that is less than nothing greater that could be conceived. So he doesn't think that argument works. The next question here is whether or not, the next argument Ganilo gives here is this. He says, when it's asserted to the fool that that this greater than all things is such that even to thought it cannot not be, and yet when this is proved to him on no other grounds than that otherwise the greater than all things would not be greater than all things, He can give the same answer reply, when did I ever say that such a being, one that is greater than all things, exists in reality, so that from this you could prove to me that it exists so fully in reality that it cannot be conceived not to be. First of all, should it be proved by some most certain argument that some superior reality, that is, a nature which is greater and better than everything that is, actually exists. From this we can prove that all other qualities, which must not be lacking from that which is greater than all things. What does Anselm say? Right? Anselm says, that which cannot that which cannot possibly not be is obviously something that can be conceived and understood. He who conceives of this conceives of something greater than he who conceives of that which has the possibility of not being, right? And so here when he says the possibility of not being, he's talking about all other types of things, right? We're going to see this is somewhat related to an argument that Aquinas gives by gradation, right? Because islands can also not exist, right? Islands can be destroyed by volcanoes, for instance. Whereas this idea of God cannot be, right? Therefore, while he is conceiving of that than which a greater cannot be conceived, if he conceives that it has the possibility of not being, he is obviously not conceiving of that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So you can see here, islands don't count, right? We have to talk about something that can only in all cases be or exist. That's what he means by greatest, or nothing greater that can be conceived of. Therefore, he who conceives of that than which nothing greater cannot be conceived is not conceiving of what can, but of what cannot possibly not be, right? This is what I mean by saying that it's a negative argument, right? For that reason, what he is conceiving must necessarily exist, because whatever is able not to exist is not that of which he is conceiving. Now, I'm not sure, going through these arguments, it's actually fairly convoluted, I think, to explain. But I think what you're gonna need to do is you're really just gonna have to sit and think through that argument for a while. I hope I've been able to clarify what it's about, right? But what does Aquinas say? Because that's one critique of the argument. What does Thomas Aquinas say? We're going to see him giving arguments for God's existence here in a moment. Well, Aquinas says, well, wait a second. How do we know that God really is the greatest thing that could be conceived? Right? Because the idea, and he's going to say the idea of God exists in the intellect, but ultimately, because of a weakness of the intellect, it's impossible to know whether or not the argument actually succeeds. So let me actually show you what Aquinas says. This again comes from, and I'll talk a little bit about St. Thomas Aquinas here in a minute. But Aquinas is one of these philosophers who's just, just brilliant. I don't agree with everything he has to say, but it's totally brilliant. This comes from the Summa Theologica, his principal work. Okay. And here's what he has to say about it. He says, nor does it result, as the first argument claimed, that as soon as the significance of the word God is understood, here maybe I'll even zoom in a little bit more. God is understood, we know that God exists. First, because not all know, even those who agree that there is a God, that God is that reality, that than which no greater can be thought. Since there were many ancient thinkers who asserted that this world is God, right? So what he's saying there is some people actually don't think that God is the greatest thing that could be conceived, right? Because some people thought that God is the world, which means that the world is what you could actually say is the greatest thing that could be conceived, something like that. So first off, not everyone agrees to that position, agrees to that concept of God. Another way of thinking about it is, if you go around and ask people whether or not they believe in God, ask them, say, well, what is you think you mean by the word God? I doubt anyone is going to say, I mean that than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? People are going to say, no, God's infinite, God's all loving and all good and so forth. They're going to have positive characteristics, which ultimately undermines that second part of Anselm's retort to Ganilo, if you remember. But Aquinas goes on. Second, because even allowing that everyone understands this word God as signifying something than which no greater can be thought, it does not follow that something from which no greater can be thought does exist in reality. For a thing exists just as its name signifies. Now, from the fact that we understand intellectually the word God is what the word God is intended to signify, nothing follows except that God is in the intellect. Therefore, it will not follow that the reality of that than which nothing greater can be thought is elsewhere than in the intellect. And hence it does not follow that there exists in reality something than which no greater can be thought, And so this is no argument against those who state that God doesn't exist, since no matter what is said to exist either in reality or in the intellect, right? Nothing prevents someone from thinking of some greater thing unless it's stipulated that there is in reality something than which no greater can be thought. So what is Aquinas arguing here? Well, Aquinas is arguing, right, that if we go back to our example, I won't draw those people, right, but if you go to our example, if we take our people who are believers here, who have the notion of God in their head, right, and we take our atheist over here who have the notion of God in their head, what Aquinas is saying, these people say that this doesn't exist. These people say that it does exist. Here's a check mark. But both of them, the truth is that the concept of God is only in the intellect. It doesn't exist in reality. And if we're going to say that God exists in reality, we have to actually know something about reality. Namely, we have to know that it's possible for there to be a limit upon what the greatest thing that could exist in reality is. And basically, our minds are too weak to know. And so, because listen to what Aquinas says as he goes on, right? He says, again, just because we may think that God does not exist, we may not conclude that we can therefore think of something greater. For we can think God does not exist, not because of any imperfection in his being, or any uncertainty connected with it, right? But because of the weakness of our intellect, right? But because of the weakness of our intellect, oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Something would happen here. So let me see if I can. Sorry about this. My computer is freezing. Okay. So anyway, I'm going to conclude it there. So that's the fundamental argument that he gives. It's sort of like this. What Aquinas would probably say is that the ontological argument could work for God, because God doesn't have a weakness of intellect. So God knows what the limit of the greatest thing in reality, what that could be. And so for God, the ontological argument works, but not for us, because our minds are too weak, essentially. When we have an idea in our head, it's still an idea in our head about the world, right? And so he wants to make this divide. So Aquinas doesn't think that the argument works. Now, it's interesting, if we go back to this question, what is proof? We could ask the question, but wait a second, does the ontological argument fulfill the elements of proof? Number one, it does seem to have clear concepts, right? But Aquinas and Ganilo seem to be articulating that there's some sort of categorical mistake that gets made. So I'll let you think about that as we keep going here, because we're running out of time if we're going to do Thomas Aquinas too. And by the way, I think the best thing to do right now is actually to pause the video. I'm going to end the video here, upload this, and then the next video I'll have is on Thomas Aquinas, because we have a 50-minute video. That's long enough. So that's the ontological argument by Anselm. The next video here will be on Thomas Aquinas. Okay, thank you very much. See you guys later. Bye.